The rain came to Falconhurst the way debt comes to a proud house, quietly at first, then all at once, seeping through the mortar until the very stones seemed to weep. It was the winter of the year the harvests failed twice, and the great manor on the moor road had learned to hold its breath against the cold. Tamsin Redmayne knew that cold, as one knows an old companion. She had grown into it, the way a plant grows sideways when denied the sun, and she wore it now in the plain grey dress that had been mended at the elbow. So often the thread had become a second fabric. She did not complain. Complaint was a luxury, and she had learned early which luxuries her life could not afford. Her father, Hollis Redmayne, had once owned 300 acres and a name that opened doors in 3 counties. Now he owned a fever, a shelf of unpaid ledgers, and a daughter who counted the candles so that the last hours of each evening might be spent in something better than darkness. The house around them had begun to die by inches. Rooms were shut one by one, their furniture shrouded in dust sheets like bodies laid out for a wake that never ended. Tamsin moved through what remained with a steadiness that unsettled the 2 servants who had not yet been let go, for she never wept, never raged, never allowed her face to become a map of her ruin. Tears were a currency she refused to spend. She had decided this at 14, standing at her mother's grave in the same grey that she wore still, and she had kept the promise through every winter since. On the night the letter came, she was in the kitchen, feeding the fire with the broken leg of a chair that would fetch nothing at market. Her father called for her from the study, his voice thin as paper held to a flame, and she went to him with her hands smelling of soot and rosemary. He was sitting in the dark, which he did more often now, as though the light shamed him. The letter lay on the desk between them, its seal already broken, a heavy dark wax the colour of old blood. He did not look at her when he spoke. He looked at the window, at the rain drawing its long silver ropes down the glass. "There is a man," he said, "a man of great wealth and greater reputation. He has made an offer, Tamsin, an offer that would settle everything. Everything." She waited. She had learned to wait for the shape of a thing before she flinched at it. The man, her father went on, was Constantine Voronin, master of Duke's Reach, the vast, cold estate that lay at the northern edge of the county, like a thing carved out of the moor itself. She knew the name the way everyone knew it, as a rumour, as a warning muttered over hedgerows. They said he was a widower who had buried his wife and never spoken of her again. They said he lived alone in a house with 100 rooms and heated only 2. They said he was miserly, severe, a man who paid his debts and forgave none, who had turned away the daughters of earls because none of them had pleased him, and none, it was whispered, ever would. "He wants a wife," her father said, and the word came out of him like a confession. "He does not want love. He does not want beauty, though God knows he could purchase it. He wants a woman who will run his house, keep his affairs in order, and ask him nothing. He has offered to clear our debts entirely, every last one. The house, the land, the creditors at the door. All of it. Gone, in exchange for you." Tamsin looked at the letter, at her father's trembling hands, at the ruin that lay all around them like snow that would never melt. She understood then that she had been sold, and she understood, too, that she had been sold cheaply, for she was not beautiful, not accomplished, not the kind of woman a rich man boasted of. She was useful. That was all. That was the whole of her value in the marketplace of her life. It was theft. Her whole future taken in a single line of dark wax. And yet she thought of the fire dying in the kitchen, of her father's cough that had begun to sound like a saw drawn through green wood, of the creditors who came now not with letters but with fists on the door. She thought of dignity, and how little it fed a man. When at last she spoke, her voice didn't shake. "If it will save you," she said, "then I will go." Her father wept then, the tears she wouldn't shed, and she stood beside him, with her hand on his shoulder, and felt nothing move in her own chest but a great and settled quiet, the quiet of a woman who has already begun the long walk toward a door she cannot see the far side of. Outside, the rain went on falling. It fell on the shrouded rooms, and the shuttered windows, and the 300 acres that had once been theirs. It fell on the road that led north, toward Duke's Reach, toward the cold house, and the colder man, and Tamsin Redmayne, 23 years old and dressed in grey, listened to it fall and did not once ask why the answer to a lifetime of unbeing had come dressed as a bargain. She had learned not to ask such questions. The asking changed nothing, and she had a house to close, and a father to bury before she could be buried herself, alive, in the great stone tomb they called a marriage. The wedding, if it could be called that, took place 3 weeks later, in a chapel so small and so cold that Tamsin's breath hung in the air before her like a ghost trying to escape. There were no flowers, there was no music. There were 4 people in the world who witnessed it, and one of them was the priest. Konstantin Voronin arrived in a black coat that fit him the way armor fits a soldier, precise and unyielding, and when he took her hand to place the ring upon it, his fingers were as cold as the stone floor beneath them. She looked up at him then, truly looked, for the first time. He was younger than the rumors had made him, perhaps 35, with a face that seemed to have been assembled entirely from severities, a hard jaw, a straight and unforgiving mouth, eyes the grey of the sea under cloud. He did not smile. She had not expected him to. But she watched him look at her, watched him take her measure in a single sweeping glance that took in the mended grey dress and the plain hair drawn back without ornament, and the hands that were not the soft hands of a lady, but the working hands of a woman who had scrubbed her own floors, and she saw something cross his face that she could not name. Not disappointment. She had expected disappointment. It was closer to relief, though she would not understand that for a long time. They spoke perhaps a dozen words to one another on the day they were married. He asked whether she was cold. She said she was accustomed to it. He looked at her a moment longer than the answer required, and then he turned and led her out to the carriage that would carry her away from everything she had known toward everything she did not. The road to Duke's Reach ran north across the open moor for the better part of a day, and Tamsin watched the country change around her from the window of the carriage, watched the hedgerows give way to bracken, and the bracken to bare stone, until at last, as the light was failing, the house rose up before them out of the dusk like something that had grown from the ground rather than been built upon it. It was enormous. It was grim. It was a house with no heart, and she knew this the moment she crossed its threshold, for the hall that received her was the size of a church and colder, and her footsteps echoed in it as though the building were empty, though she could see the shapes of servants standing along the walls, silent and watchful, waiting to judge the woman their master had brought home from the ruin of a lesser family. Konstantin did not introduce her to them. He said only, "This is the house," and then he handed her into the care of a housekeeper and disappeared through a far door as though he had discharged an obligation and had no wish to linger over it. The housekeeper was an old woman named Isolde Hargreave, with a spine like a poker and eyes that missed nothing, and she led Tamsin, through corridor after corridor of shrouded rooms and shuttered windows, past portraits of Voronins long dead, who stared down from the walls with the same cold grey eyes as the living one, until they reached the wing where, it seemed, Tamsin was to live. "My lady," Isolde said, and the title sat strangely on Tamsin, who had never in her life been anyone's lady. "This is your apartment. The master keeps the east tower. He is not to be disturbed there." That was the whole of the instruction, and Tamsin understood from the flatness of it that she had been given not a home but a set of rooms, and not a husband but a wall she was to keep her distance from. She thanked the old woman and went in and shut the door, and stood for a long while in the centre of the cold apartment, listening to the great house settle around her, the creaks and groans of old timber, the wind finding its way through gaps in the stone. She did not weep. She unpacked the small trunk that held everything she owned in the world, the 2 other grey dresses, the mended shawl, the little wooden box that had been her mother's, and she laid these things out in the vast and empty room, and she felt how small they were against so much stone. In the days that followed, she learned the shape of her captivity. She dined alone, for the master, she was told, took his meals in the east tower and did not care to be joined. She saw him rarely, a dark figure crossing a distant corridor, a shadow at the far end of the great hall, and on the few occasions their paths crossed, he inclined his head to her with a courtesy so cold it was worse than rudeness, and passed on without a word. The servants watched her, with the wary suspicion of people who have seen many things come into a house, and few of them prosper. She was a curiosity to them, the plain bride, the bargain wife, the woman who had been bought to run a house she was not permitted to enter more than a fraction of. She might have withered there. Many would have. But Tamsin Redmayne had spent her life being useful in a house that was dying, and she looked at this house, this great, cold, heartless house, and she saw, beneath the dust sheets and behind the shuttered windows, not a prison, but a patient. It was sick, she thought. It had been sick for a long time, and she knew, better than anyone alive, how to sit at the bedside of a dying thing and coax it, room by room, back toward the light. She began, as she had always begun, with what no one was watching. There was a room in the west wing that even the servants had forgotten, a library long shuttered, its shelves furred with dust, its high windows so grimed that the daylight entered them the colour of weak tea. Tamsin found it on her 4th day in the house, following a draught to its source the way she had followed her father's voice through the dark, and when she pushed open the swollen door and saw what lay inside, something in her that had been holding very still for a very long time began at last to move. Books, thousands of them, leather and vellum and cracked gilt, ranked along the walls from the floor to a ceiling, lost in shadow, and among them, tumbled and neglected, the whole quiet furniture of a life that someone had once loved and then abandoned. A globe with the continents rubbed nearly bare, a pianoforte with a broken string, a great desk with a drawer that would not close. She stood in the doorway and breathed in the smell of it, the dust and the leather and the faint sweetness of old paper, and she felt for the first time since she had come to Duke's Reach that she had found a room that would let her in. She told no one. She simply began, in the hours between her solitary meals, to bring the room back. She opened the shutters and washed the windows until the light came through them gold. She dusted the shelves, one by one, and as she dusted, she read, snatches here and there, poetry and history and the memoirs of dead travellers, and the reading fed something in her that had gone hungry for years. She oiled the swollen door until it swung sweet and silent. She found, in a cupboard, a store of good beeswax candles that no one had thought to use, and she set them in the sconces and lit them, and the room that had been dead for years came alive around her, warm and gold and quiet, a heart beating faintly in the cold body of the house. It was here that Konstantin Voronin found her, 3 weeks after she had come to his home, on an evening when the wind was high and the rest of the house lay dark. He had not meant to. He had been walking, as he often walked when the tower grew too small for the weight of his thoughts, and he had seen light beneath a door that had been dark for 11 years, and he had come to it the way a man comes to a wound he thought long healed. He pushed the door open without knocking, for it was his house, and he had never once in his life imagined he would need to knock in it, and he stopped on the threshold, as though he had walked into a wall. There she was, his wife, the plain grey woman he had married to, run his affairs and ask him nothing, sitting in a pool of candlelight with a book open in her lap and her plain hair coming loose about her face, and the room around her, his mother's library, the room he had not been able to enter since the day they carried his mother's coffin out of it, warm and living and golden as it had been in his childhood. He did not speak for a long moment. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Tamsin looked up and saw him and did not startle, only closed the book over her finger to keep her place, and waited, as she always waited, for the shape of the thing before she flinched at it. "This room," he said at last, and his voice was not flat now, was not cold, but rough, as though the words were being drawn up from somewhere very deep and very old. "This room has been closed for 11 years. She looked at him steadily. It was a pity, she said, to keep such a room in the dark. It only wanted opening. Something moved in his face then, some struggle she could not read, and she understood, watching him, that she had trespassed on something more tender than mere property. "I did not know it was your mother's," she said quietly, for she had guessed it from the portrait above the mantel, a fair woman with kind eyes, and Konstantin's own stubborn jaw. "I will close it again, if you wish." "No." The word came out of him hard and fast, and then he seemed to catch himself, and when he spoke again it was more measured. "No. Leave it." "It is." He stopped. He looked around the room, at the clean windows and the ranked candles, and the books she had begun to set in order, and something in the hard line of his shoulders eased by the smallest degree. "It is well done," he said. It was not much, but it was more than he had said to her in 3 weeks, and she recognized it for what it was, an offering, awkward and unaccustomed, from a man who had forgotten how to make them. He did not leave at once. He crossed the room, slowly, and stood before the portrait of his mother, and Tamsin sat very still in her chair and let him have his silence, for she knew the weight of the dead and how they lean upon the living, and she knew that some griefs are only made worse by words. When at last he turned to go, he paused at the door and looked back at her, at the plain grey woman in the golden light, and there passed over his severe face something that was not quite a smile, the almost of a smile, the ghost of the thing itself. "You are not," he said slowly, as though discovering it, "what I expected." And then he was gone, and the door swung shut, sweet and silent, behind him on its newly oiled hinges, and Tamsin Redmayne sat alone in the warm, bright room she had made from ruin, and pressed her hand flat against the cover of the book, and did not weep, though something in her had shifted, like a stone rolled back from the mouth of a cave, letting in, for the first time in a very long time, a thin and unfamiliar light. Before we go on, if this story has drawn you in, If you find yourself leaning toward the warmth of that golden room, take a moment to subscribe so the next tale can find its way to you when the nights are long and the fire is low. Now, back to the house on the moor, where the ice had only just begun to break. The days that followed were different, though neither of them spoke of the difference. Constantine began to come to the library in the evenings. He did not announce it, and he did not ask leave. He simply appeared, a book of his own in hand, and took the chair on the far side of the hearth, and for an hour or two they would sit in a silence that had ceased to be cold and become, by slow degrees, companionable. Tamsin learned the rhythm of him, the way he read with a slight frown, as though every book were an argument he intended to win, the way he would sometimes stop and stare into the fire as though seeing something in it that pained him, the way his hands, which she had thought cold as stone on their wedding day, were gentle around the spine of a book he loved. She learned that he was not miserly at all, whatever the county whispered. She learned it from the account books he began, cautiously, to trust her with, and found there not the greed of a hoarder, but the desperate, careful economy of a man carrying some great and secret weight. For there was a weight. She had known it from the first, the way one knows there is a stone in a shoe from the smallest hitch in a stranger's walk, and she came to know its name on a night when the wind was screaming across the moor, and she woke in the small hours to a sound she could not place, a thin, high crying that seemed to come from the depths of the house, from the east tower where she was forbidden to go. She lay still and listened. It came again and again, a child's cry, unmistakable, and beneath it a man's voice, low and steady and infinitely tired, murmuring words she could not hear. Tamsin rose. She took a candle, and she went, in her nightgown and her mended shawl, along the cold corridors toward the sound, past the portraits of the dead Voronins with their grey and watchful eyes, up the winding stair of the east tower that she had been told never to climb. The door at the top stood ajar, and through it she saw a room she hadn't imagined in that grim house, a warm room, a nursery, hung with soft things and lit by a low fire. And in it, Constantine Voronin on his knees beside a small bed, and in the bed a child, a little girl, perhaps 4 years old, thin and pale and shaking, her small face contorted with the effort of breathing, and her father, the cold, severe master of Duke's Reach, holding her against his chest and rocking her, his hard face open and desperate and wet, at last, with the tears that Tamsin had never allowed herself to shed. He saw her in the doorway. For a moment they stared at one another across the firelight, the secret laid bare between them, and she saw him brace, as though for a blow, as though he expected her to recoil, to flee, to sell the knowledge as her father had sold her. She did none of these things. She set down her candle and crossed the room and knelt beside them and looked at the struggling child, and every instinct that a hard life had honed in her came awake at once. "She has a fever," Tamsin said, low and calm. "Her chest is tight. Bring me steam, and thyme if the kitchen has any, and a basin of cold water and clean cloths." Constantine did not move for a moment, unaccustomed to being commanded in his own tower, and then something in her steadiness reached him, and he laid the child gently down and went, himself, without waking a single servant, to fetch the things she asked. Through the long hours of that night, they worked together over the little girl, whose name, he told her in a rough whisper, was Pia. Tamsin sat her upright against the pillows so that she might breathe, and bathed her burning brow with cool water, and when the kitchen thyme had been steeped in boiling water, She held the child over the fragrant steam and rubbed her narrow back with a patience that did not falter through hour after hour. Constantine knelt beside them the whole while, and slowly, as the fever broke and the child's breathing eased, and she slipped at last into a true and healing sleep, he began to speak. He told her what the county did not know, and would never learn from his lips. His first wife had not simply died. She had borne him a child who came into the world too soon and too frail, a child the physicians had said would not see her first winter, and then her second, and then her third. And each year the woman he had married had grown to hate the sickly daughter who tethered them to this remote house, until at last she had gone, fled to the continent with a man who could give her the gay, bright life she craved, and died there of a fever herself within the year, unmourned and unmissed. And Constantine had been left with a dying child, and a ruined name, and a fortune bleeding away into physicians who could promise nothing, and he had shut himself in his tower with his daughter and his shame, and he had let the world believe him cold and cruel and miserly, because it was easier than letting the world learn that the great Veronin heir was a frail little girl who might not live, a girl who would be pitied and whispered over, and never left in peace. "I married you," he said, not looking at her, his hand resting on the sleeping child's hair, "because I needed someone to run the house, so that I might give my hours to her. I told myself I chose a plain, practical woman, because such a woman would make no demands, would want no love I had none left to give, would ask me nothing." He was silent a moment. "I did not expect," he said, "that she would open my mother's library. I did not expect that she would kneel beside my daughter in the dark and know exactly what to do. I did not expect her at all." Tamsin looked at the sleeping child, at the man bowed beside her, and she understood that the bargain she had thought had bought her had in truth bought something neither of them had bargained for. "I am glad you told me," she said simply. "I am glad to know her." And from that night the walls between them, which had already begun to crack, came down in earnest, not with declarations, for neither of them was made for declarations, but with the slow accumulation of shared work and shared vigil and shared care. Tamsin took Peer into her keeping as naturally as she had taken the dying library, and the child, starved for warmth as the house itself had been, bloomed under her hands. Tamsin sat with her through the bad nights, and read to her through the long convalescent days tales from the golden library that the little girl devoured with hungry eyes. She discovered that a garden lay behind the east tower, walled and neglected, choked with bramble, and she set the idle grooms to clearing it, and planted it out that spring with hardy things that would survive the moor wind, and roses, above all roses, and she carried Peer out to sit among them, wrapped in blankets, so that the child might feel the sun on her face and smell something living. And Constantine watched. He watched his daughter grow stronger than the physicians had ever dared to hope. He watched the house that had been a tomb become, room by room, a home, the shutters thrown open, the dust sheets folded away, the great cold hall warmed by fires that Tamsin ordered lit without asking his leave, for she had stopped, by degrees, being a guest in his house, and become its heart. And he watched his wife, the plain grey woman he had married as one signs a contract, and found that he could no longer imagine the tower, or the house, or his own hard life without her in it. He said none of this, but he began to have the long dining table shortened at her quiet suggestion, so that they might sit near one another at meals instead of shouting the length of a banqueting hall, and he began to take those meals with her and with Pia between them. And the three of them, the cold man and the plain woman and the frail child who was growing less frail by the week, became, without any of them naming it, a family. It could not last undisturbed. Such peace never does, for the world outside the walls had not forgotten Duke's Reach, and the world had a face, and the face belonged to Lavinia de Vere. She was the daughter of the neighboring estate, beautiful in the hard, bright way of a diamond, and she had spent 3 years believing that Konstantin Voronin's fortune and Konstantin Voronin's hand were promised to her by every law of nature and precedence. For was she not the loveliest woman in the county, the most accomplished, the most sought? That he had married instead the penniless plain daughter of a ruined man was to Lavinia not merely a disappointment, but an insult, a theft, a wrong that cried out to be redressed. She came to Duke's Reach that summer under the guise of a neighbourly call, and Tamsin received her in the warm, bright drawing-room she had made, poured her tea, and endured with her habitual stillness the long, slow inventory of Lavinia's eyes, which moved over the mended cuffs of the grey dress and the plain, unornamented hair, and found them, as they were meant to be found, wanting. "How brave you are," Lavinia said, her voice sweet as spoiled honey, "to keep so simple a style, when you might command anything now. But then I suppose one cannot change what one is born to." Tamsin only inclined her head and offered more tea, and this restraint, this refusal to be wounded, enraged Lavinia more than any retort could have done. She began to talk, then in the county, in the drawing-rooms and at the assemblies, and her talk was poison dressed as concern. She let it be understood that the plain Mrs. Voronin was no true wife at all, but a kind of upper servant, a housekeeper elevated above her station, married for her cheapness and kept for her use. She let it be whispered that there was a child hidden in the tower, a shameful secret, a monstrous thing the Voronins concealed from decent eyes, and she let the whispers grow until they had teeth. And then, when the county gathered that autumn for the great hunt ball at Aldermore Hall, the largest assembly of the year, Lavinia de Vere decided that the time had come to finish what her whispers had begun. Tamsin had not wished to go. She had no love of ballrooms and no gowns fit for them, and she knew what waited for her there. But Constantine, who had not attended a public gathering in 11 years, surprised her and the whole county by announcing that he would go and that his wife would go with him, and he had a gown made for her, a gown of deep green silk that she protested she could not wear, until he said quietly, "Wear it for me," and she found she could refuse him nothing. Isolde Hargrave, the old housekeeper who had come to love her with the fierce loyalty of a woman who had waited 11 years to see the house live again, dressed her hair herself and stood back and pronounced, with her poker spine and her missing-nothing eyes, that any fool who looked at her and saw a servant deserved to be as blind as they were, determined to be. So Tamsin went, in green silk with her plain, honest face, and for a while the evening passed in a haze of candlelight and music and the cold curiosity of 100 strangers. And then Lavinia de Vere, beautiful and certain and armed, crossed the floor toward her before the assembled county and struck. She did it loudly, so that the room would hear, timing her words for the lull between dances when the music died and the great hall fell quiet. "How singular it must be for you," she said, her lovely voice pitched to carry, "to play the great lady tonight, when we all know what you truly are. A tradesman's bargain, a woman bought to keep house and mind the master's little monster in the tower. That poor, deformed creature he hides away in shame. Tell me, does he pay you wages, or only the roof over your head?" The room went utterly still. Faces turned. Fans stopped moving. Tamsin stood in the center of that circle of cold, curious eyes, in her green silk, with the insult ringing in the air. And she did not flinch, and she did not weep, and she did not, though every soul in that room expected it, break. She looked at Lavinia de Vere with a steadiness that made the beautiful woman's smile falter at its edges. And into that silence, before Tamsin could speak, before she needed to, another voice fell, low and hard and carrying the whole length of the great hall. It was Constantine. He had come to stand at his wife's side, and his severe face was terrible now. Not cold, but blazing, and when he spoke, he did not shout, and he did not need to, for the room hung upon every word. "You will hear me," he said, "and I will say this once, and I will say it before all of you, so that there can be no whisper afterward that claims not to have heard it plainly. This woman is my wife. She is not a bargain, and she is not a servant, and she is worth more, every ounce of her, than every soul in this room laid together in the scale against her." She looked at Lavinia, whose face had gone white beneath its rouge. "My daughter is not a monster, and not a shame. She is a child who was born frail and who lives and grows strong, because of the woman you have just insulted, who knelt beside her bed through fevers that would have broken any of you, who asked nothing, who was promised nothing, and who gave everything." He turned then, slowly, so that his words fell upon every face in the room. "You call her plain. I tell you, I have looked at beautiful women all my life, and found nothing behind their eyes but the wish to be looked at. She opened a room in my house that had been shut for 11 years, and she did not know it was my mother's, and she did it because she could not bear to see a good thing kept in the dark. She healed a house I had let die. She healed a child I had been told would not live. She healed me." His voice did not rise, but it deepened, and it filled the hall like a bell. "You have spent 3 years," he said to Lavinia, "wanting my name and my fortune, and never once in all that time did you ask after the child, though the whole county knew I had one. You did not ask because you did not care, because you saw a name and a purse, and never once a living soul behind them. And she," he said, and he took Tamsin's hand before them all, "she asked after the child before she asked after anything, because she is made of the only currency that has ever meant anything to me, which is not beauty, and is not wealth, but is truth, and is kindness, and is the steadiness to do the hard, right thing when no one is watching and no reward is promised. I did not marry her for love. I will say that plainly, for she would want me to be honest even now. But I love her. I love her, and I have loved her since the night I found her in my mother's library, making light out of the dark, and I would not trade her, not for you, not for all the beauty in this county, not for anything under heaven. The silence that followed was absolute. Lavinia de Vere stood exposed in the center of it, her cruelty turned back upon her, her beauty suddenly a cold and empty thing, and the faces that had turned to watch Tamsin, humiliated, now turned, one by one, away from Lavinia in a slow and terrible verdict, and she understood that she had lost, not the man, for she had never truly had him, but the only thing she had ever truly valued, which was the good opinion of the room. She fled. She left the ball and, within the month, the county, and she was spoken of afterward, not with hatred, but with a kind of pity, as a woman who had held every advantage, and squandered them all upon her own hard heart. And Tamsin, standing in her green silk with her husband's hand warm around her own, at long last, felt the sting of tears behind her eyes, and this once, she let them come, not the tears of grief that she had refused all her life, but the other kind, the kind that fall when a thing long buried is finally, fully seen. 1 year later, the roses came again to the walled garden behind the east tower, and they came in such profusion that the old grooms shook their heads and said they had never seen the like, as though the ground itself had decided to make up for the years it had been made to lie barren. Duke's Reach was not the house it had been. The shutters stood open now, the length of every wing, and the dust sheets had long since been carried away and burned, and fires burned in the grates that had been cold for a decade, and the great hall that had once echoed with the emptiness of a church rang instead with the sound of a child running. For Pia Voronin, who had not been meant to see her 4th winter, had seen her 5th now and her 6th, and she ran the length of the corridors with the strength of any child in the county, and her laughter had become the true and beating heart of the house. Tamsin walked in the rose garden in the last gold light of a summer evening, in a dress that was no longer grey, for Constantine could not abide the grey any longer, and had filled her wardrobe with the colours of the garden she had made. And she watched her husband kneel in the grass to let their daughter climb upon his back. This severe and formidable man, reduced to a laughing beast of burden by a small girl's command, and she thought of the cold chapel where she had married a stranger with hands like stone, and she marvelled, quietly in her way, at the distance a life could travel. Isolde Hargreave sat in the shade with her poker spine unbent by all her years, and pronounced, to no one in particular, that she had always known how it would end, that she had seen it in the girl the first night she walked into the house looking like a wren among crows, and that anyone who had thought otherwise had wanted their eyes examining. And Constantine, setting his daughter down among the roses, crossed the grass to his wife and stood beside her in the fading light, and he did not need to say anything, for they had long since passed the country of words and come into the quieter land beyond it, where a hand laid over a hand said all that 100 speeches could not. But he said it anyway, softly, only for her. "You are not what I expected," he said, as he had said on the first night in the library, and she heard now the whole of what he had not been able to say then, the wonder and the gratitude, and the love that had grown from the smallest seed in the coldest ground. And Tamsin Redmayne, who had been sold cheaply and found herself beyond price, who had refused all her life to weep, and now wept freely and gladly among the roses she had planted, leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, and watched their daughter chase the last of the light across the warm and living garden, and answered him at last with the almost of a smile become, now, the whole and certain thing. "No," she said, "I am better. Thank you for staying with me to the end of this story, for sitting a while in that warm golden room out on the cold moor. I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight, and whether Tamsin's quiet strength reached you the way it reached the man who nearly missed her. Tell me in the comments, and if this tale warmed you even a little, subscribe, and let the next one find its way to you when the fire burns low.